and welcome back to our third Advent special episode of Religious Rejects in this season, as the Religious Rejects deal with issues with our Christmas stories.
Today's going to be a fun one, because I didn't actually realize that this was an issue. I mean, I knew it was an issue, but I didn't really know it was an issue until we started looking at this.
Oh, yeah.
And was Jesus of Nazareth born in Galilee or in Bethlehem?
Yeah.
Because he was supposed to have been born in Bethlehem, correct?
Well, he's really born in Nazareth, which is in Galilee. So,
And that's kind of far apart, right?
Well, in that time, yes, it would have been a long ways away from each other. Yes. So, what if the real historical event surrounding Jesus's birth wasn't a census like Luke talks about, but a violent Roman crackdown right next door to his home village of Nazareth?
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, this is something I didn't know about until very recently. So, so this is a whole thing. It's called the Sepphoris Revolt.
Okay. And Sepphoris is a name of a guy? Or...
Sepphoris is a town, a little town that was maybe like 4 miles maybe from the town of Nazareth.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So pretty wild.
Okay.
We've talked in a previous episode, we kind of break down the Christmas stories according to the Gospels of Matthew, Luke, Mark, and John. Obviously, Mark and John do not have Christmas stories, so it's mainly Matthew and Luke. But, we have Christmas songs that say, like, "O Little Town of Bethlehem," right?
Yes.
So why does Bethlehem matter?
So Bethlehem, from what I understand, in those stories from Matthew and Luke, Bethlehem is mentioned, and especially in Matthew, being so predominantly for the religious leaders and the Jewish elite. They had to prove that Jesus was the guy that was prophesied in Isaiah. And in Isaiah, they talk about the Messiah should come from Bethlehem. Okay, so Bethlehem is a key if you're going to decide that Jesus is the Messiah. So they've got to make him come through Bethlehem somehow.
Got it. Yep. Well, that makes sense. Okay. That's the issue with Bethlehem. There's another issue from the Gospel of Luke, which is about the census that Quirinius requires them, Quirinius requires Mary and Joseph to go to a census, and they have to go to Bethlehem for the census. And the reality is that this is historically impossible, that this is not actually something that could have happened. Scholars have been looking at this for many years and have had many debates about this. Their consensus now is that Jesus was born between 7 and 4 BC, not at year 0 or 1, according to our calendar now. So, and the census that is referred to in this Quirinius' census, it actually took place in the year 6. So, Jesus would have been, anywhere from he could have been even 10 years old by that point. So, and it was a decade after Herod the Great's death. So that's, there's no way that could have happened when Jesus was an infant. Also, the Romans, in their governmental system, they never required people to return to their ancestral towns. This is very well documented, and there's just no way. So there's a reason. It's not for historical reasons, but there's another reason that Luke is doing this. Luke is trying to tie Jesus to Bethlehem for, theological and a narrative arc rather than for a historical fact.
So you're saying, though, that the real big event at this time that drove people supposedly to Bethlehem? Or
no,
not to Bethlehem?
Not related to Bethlehem at all.
Okay. Oh, but there was a big event.
That the defining event probably of Jesus's life would have happened either right before he was born or in his first few years of life. And that would have been the Sepphoris Revolt.
Okay.
And this is documented through histories written about the Jewish people from a historian named Josephus. And so what happened is Herod the Great, who was the king of the Jewish people at this time, the father of the Herod that shows up in Jesus's, in the Gospels later on, where
Okay.
they're killing John the Baptist and all that stuff. So Herod the Great is the father of the Herod from the Gospels that we know. He died around 4 BC. And there's uprising across Judea and Galilee, and the Jewish people are trying to overthrow the Roman governance of themselves. They're trying to free themselves. And in Sepphoris, a small town, which was bigger than the town that Jesus was born in, which was Nazareth, in Sepphoris, there's a guy named Judas, who's the son of Ezekias, and he leads a group of rebels into the Roman armory, and they steal the weapons, and they start an uprising against the Roman soldiers that are in the area.
Wow.
Now, anybody who knows Rome knows that Rome is very serious about uprisings, and they do not take these things lightly. So the Romans come in with tons of soldiers, and they put down this revolt really violently. They kill all the men, they enslave the women, they enslave the children, they destroy the town of Sepphoris, and they crucify anyone that they catch that was a rebel, one of the rebels that broke into the armory and all that stuff. And then they destroy the town. They burn it to the ground, basically. And they probably would have done that in towns in the area around Sepphoris. And Nazareth was so close that it probably also was affected by the crackdown on Jewish rebels. There would have been this terrible devastation where everyone would have said, oh, the day the Romans came, the day the Romans came. The Romans, killed your aunt, your grandparents, whatever. We used to go to Sepphoris, and what they ended up doing is that they made Sepphoris into a model Roman town. And so there was this huge reconstruction effort, and they made it into this, beautiful new, not Jewish, but Roman town. And so they erased kind of the Jewish identity of that place. And people speculate, perhaps Jesus's father Joseph, being a builder or a carpenter, he could have been involved in the reconstruction of the town after the devastation. So if you think about this experience, it could have really shaped Jesus's worldview from a very young age. He would have been aware of how the Romans had been taking advantage of the Jewish people with their heavy taxation and economic exploitation. He would have been very aware of the terrible violence that the Roman Empire was capable of. And there would have been a lot of resentment against the Roman Empire for having destroyed so many people's lives and livelihood and killed them. When you think about this story, which I had never heard of until very recently, when you think about this Sepphoris revolt and being so close to where Jesus was born, hearing all the later messages that Jesus talks about with peace and resistance and justice, they hit very differently than they ever did before I knew this story.
So then Luke then chooses to rewrite the birth narrative or whatever as a way possibly to realign things, to show that Jesus was the Messiah. So when later Jesus, who has possibly witnessed these things and now has this maybe call on his life to take down the Romans somehow, some way, whatever it is, or those around him that wanted to say this was the Messiah, this was the guy, then Luke is going to rewrite all of these things into it or add these details that may not have been true just to kind of bolster that story that Jesus was who he said he was.
Right.
Kind of a
And I
thing.
think also to really make those connections to some of the stories that people would have known about and to really show that he was coming from a tradition that he was fulfilling prophecies and things like that. And so, because, a big question people had is like, well, if Jesus is the Messiah, then why did he die? Why was he crucified? And so people had to defend the story of Jesus and who Jesus was against these questions that people had. And so they were making these connections, Luke and Matthew, to the Jewish stories of, the prophecies about a Messiah coming to save them. In the meantime, Luke is taking, this basically erases this whole story of the violent crackdown of the Romans against the Jewish people right around the time of Jesus's birth or his early toddler years. So it's kind of wild that none of this shows up in any of the gospel stories or in the story of how Jesus came to be who he was.
And yet it feels like it'd be a very, very important piece to that puzzle.
Absolutely.
And there's no shepherds, no magi, no magical donkeys.
No dragons
No
either from those
dragons.
infancy narratives from other gospels. When we look at Jesus being born in the area of Galilee, in Nazareth, which, when Paul talks about Jesus, it's all Jesus of Nazareth.
Yeah.
And so the earliest traditions about Jesus all talk about Jesus being from Nazareth, not Bethlehem.
Yes, because let's remind viewers that Paul actually started writing about Jesus first.
Yes.
And Paul was very much stated repeatedly that Jesus was from Nazareth. It wasn't until later that they started to add these quote unquote details that may have been misleading, but tried to paint a bit of a different picture.
Absolutely. If Jesus was from Nazareth and that was where he grew up, and he grew up in the shadow of this terrible, horrifically violent crackdown of the Roman army against a Jewish uprising and rebellion, Jesus would have had everyday experiences of knowing what it was like to live among the Romans, possibly even, if his dad was a builder or a carpenter, he might have helped his dad out in the reconstruction of Sepphoris, and he would have known what it was like to work under the Romans. He would have known what it was like to be colonized by the Romans, the Jewish people being colonized by them, and, what it was like to work and never make any money, not be able to get out of the economic hole that they were in. And so this region was known for rebellion, which also, when you think about some of the concerns that come up about Jesus in his lifetime, when you hear about, people plotting against him and things like that, if you know that he comes from a rebellious part of the world, a rebellious corner of the world, their concern about him makes a lot more sense.
Absolutely.
He's much more dangerous, I think, because he comes from an area that had sponsored a rebellion at one point.
Bit of a loose cannon there.
Bit of a loose cannon,
That's
yeah.
right.
Thanks for tuning in. Up next, will the rejects keep, rethink, or reject today's topic? Stay with us.
So today, as we are finishing this third episode of our Advent Calendar special, where we're exploring different Christmas issues, we invite you to keep, rethink, and reject what is important to you, what you are thinking about and rejecting or reframing in all of these stories. So I hope that hearing this story about the Sepphoris revolt helps, give more context to who Jesus was. I found it fascinating and can't wait to hear what you think about it.
And let us know in the comments what you're thinking, what you're keeping, what you're rejecting, or what you want us to talk about in another episode. Thanks so much for joining us.
See you next time.